The sound of a baby's cry pierced the silence of the Montana night, a stark contrast to the stillness that had fallen over the small cabin. Hank Morgan stood frozen, his weathered hands trembling as he held his newborn daughter for the first time, while behind him, the midwife pulled a sheet over his wife's peaceful face. In that moment, the spring of 1873 became both the beginning and the end of everything he knew. "I'm sorry, Mr. Morgan," the midwife whispered, her voice barely audible over the infant's wails. "She lost too much blood. There was nothing more to be done." Hank couldn't bring himself to look at the woman. His eyes remained fixed on his daughter, so small, so fragile, with wisps of dark hair like her mother's. Eliza had wanted to name her Grace. Grace Morgan. The name echoed in his mind as he tried to comprehend how something so beautiful could emerge from such profound loss. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked, the question directed at no one in particular. The midwife, Mrs. Patterson, stepped forward and gently adjusted his hold on the baby. "You'll need to find someone who can help with the feeding. A wet nurse. She needs milk, and soon." Her practicality cut through his fog of grief. "I can take her to town for tonight, but you'll need to make arrangements." Hank nodded numbly, reluctantly handing over his daughter. The weight of Eliza's absence pressed down on him as he watched Mrs. Patterson bundle the baby and prepare to leave. He wanted to stop her, to keep his daughter close, the only piece of Eliza he had left, but he knew he couldn't care for a newborn on his own. "I'll come for her tomorrow," he promised, his voice cracking. "I'll figure something out." After they left, Hank sank to his knees beside the bed where his wife lay. Eliza had been everything to him since he'd arrived in Montana Territory 3 years earlier. They'd built this life together, the small ranch, the cattle operation, the dreams of a family. Now half of that partnership was gone, leaving him with responsibilities he had no idea how to fulfill. "I don't know how to do this without you," he whispered to Eliza, taking her cold hand in his. "How am I supposed to raise our daughter alone?" The night passed in a blur of grief and whiskey. By morning, Hank had come to a grim resolution. He would find someone to take the baby, a good family in town perhaps, someone who could give her what he couldn't. The thought tore at his heart, but what choice did he have? A rancher with no wife, long days in the saddle, and no knowledge of caring for an infant, what kind of life could he offer her? Hank hitched his wagon and made the journey into Meadow Creek, the small town that served as a trading post for the surrounding ranches. His eyes were bloodshot, his face unshaven, as he made his way to Mrs. Patterson's home to collect Grace before finding her a new family. The midwife opened the door, the baby cradled in her arms. "Mr. Morgan, I've been expecting you," she said, her expression softening at the sight of him. "Come in, we need to talk about the little one." Hank followed her inside, his hat clutched in his hands. The small home was warm and smelled of fresh bread. He felt out of place among the domesticity. "I've been thinking," he began, the words coming out rough and strained. "Maybe it's best if I find someone who can take her, a proper family. I don't know the first thing about babies, and without Eliza." Mrs. Patterson frowned. "This child needs her father, Mr. Morgan. I understand your grief, but giving her away won't ease it. What am I supposed to do then?" Hank asked, frustration rising in his voice. "I can't feed her. I can't be with her all day. I have a ranch to run." "I may have a solution," Mrs. Patterson replied. "Victoria Harmon arrived in town last month. She's a widow herself, came west after losing her husband back east. She's been looking for work and she has experience with children. I spoke with her this morning when I was trying to find someone to help with the baby's feeding." "A stranger," Hank shook his head. "I can't just hand my daughter over to someone I don't know." "Not hand her over," Mrs. Patterson corrected. "Hire her as a nurse for the child. She could live at your ranch, care for the baby while you work. It's not uncommon for widowers to make such arrangements." Hank considered this. Having someone at the ranch would mean he wouldn't have to give Grace up entirely. But the idea of another woman in Eliza's home, caring for Eliza's child, felt like a betrayal. "I'd like to meet her at least," he said finally, "before I decide anything." Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly. "She's at the general store now getting supplies." "I told her you might be interested in speaking with her." The general store was busy with the usual Saturday morning crowd when Hank entered. He scanned the room, not knowing who he was looking for until a young woman with auburn hair caught his eye. She was speaking with the shopkeeper, a basket on her arm and a list in her hand. There was something purposeful about her movements, a quiet confidence that drew his attention. Mrs. Patterson appeared at his side. "That's her, Victoria Harmon." Hank nodded, watching as Victoria finished her transaction and turned toward them. She couldn't have been more than 25, with clear green eyes that seemed to assess everything around her with careful consideration. "Mrs. Harmon," the midwife called, waving her over. "This is Mr. Morgan, the gentleman I mentioned to you this morning." Victoria approached, her expression warm but cautious. "Mr. Morgan, I'm very sorry for your loss." Hank removed his hat, suddenly conscious of his disheveled appearance. "Thank you, madam, Mrs. Patterson tells me you have a newborn daughter who needs looking after," she continued. "I want you to know I have experience with infants. I worked as a governess for several years back in Boston before my marriage." "I haven't decided yet what I'm going to do," Hank said, more abruptly than he'd intended. Victoria nodded, seeming to understand his hesitation. "Of course, it's a significant decision. Perhaps we could discuss it further. I'm staying at the boarding house. We could talk there or wherever you'd feel comfortable." There was something in her directness that Hank appreciated. No platitudes or excessive sympathy, just a practical approach to the situation at hand. "Maybe you could come out to the ranch," he suggested. "See the place, meet Grace. If this is going to work, you'd be living there after all." "That seems sensible," Victoria agreed. "When would be convenient for you?" "I need to make arrangements for my wife's." He couldn't bring himself to say the word burial. "I need to take care of some things in town today. But perhaps tomorrow I could send a wagon for you." "Tomorrow would be fine, Mr. Morgan, and please don't trouble yourself with sending a wagon. I can arrange transportation." As Victoria left to finish her errands, Hank turned to Mrs. Patterson. "What do you know about her?" "Not much," the midwife admitted. "She keeps to herself mostly, but she came with good references from her previous employer in Boston. She's educated, capable, and most importantly, she has a kind heart. I've seen her with other children in town." Hank nodded, watching Victoria's retreating figure. He wasn't sure about any of this, but he was running out of options. And something about Victoria Harmon's steady gaze gave him a small measure of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, he wouldn't have to face this impossible situation entirely alone. The following day dawned clear and cool. Hank had spent the night in the barn, unable to face the bedroom he had shared with Eliza. Grace remained in town with Mrs. Patterson, who had found a woman able to nurse her temporarily. The thought of bringing his daughter home without her mother was almost unbearable, but Hank knew he couldn't postpone it forever. He was repairing a fence near the main road when he spotted a horse and rider approaching. It took him a moment to recognize Victoria, dressed in a practical riding habit, her hair neatly pinned beneath a simple hat. She rode confidently, handling the horse with ease, something he hadn't expected from a city woman. "Mr. Morgan," she called as she drew closer. "I hope I'm not too early." Hank set down his tools and walked to meet her. "No, madam, you're right on time." He helped her dismount, noticing that she carried only a small bag. "Did you bring your belongings?" "Just a few essentials," Victoria explained. "I thought it best to see if the arrangement suits us both before moving everything." Her practicality continued to impress him. "That's sensible. Let me show you around." The ranch wasn't large by Montana standards, 80 acres with a small herd of cattle, a few horses, and enough crop land to support the animals and provide for his own needs. The cabin was simple but sturdy, built by Hank's own hands with Eliza's input on every detail. Leading Victoria inside felt like an intrusion on the life he and Eliza had created, but he pushed the feeling aside. "It's not much," he said, watching Victoria survey the main room with its stone fireplace, rough-hewn table, and modest furnishings. "There's the bedroom through there and a small room off the kitchen that we were preparing for the baby. You could take that room, or we could arrange something in the loft." Victoria nodded thoughtfully. "It's a fine home, Mr. Morgan, solid and well built." She moved toward the small room he had indicated, peering inside at the half-finished crib and the chest of drawers Hank had made during the winter evenings. "This will be perfect for the baby. And for you?" Hank asked, suddenly worried that the accommodations might not be acceptable to someone who had lived in Boston. Victoria turned to face him, her expression earnest. "Mr. Morgan, I didn't come west expecting luxury. The loft will be more than sufficient for my needs. My concern is whether I can be useful to you and your daughter." Her directness was refreshing. "I don't know the first thing about caring for a baby," Hank admitted. "Eliza, she was prepared, she had it all planned out, but me, I'm lost." "That's understandable," Victoria said gently. "No one expects you to know everything right away, but you won't be alone in this. If you'll allow me to help, I promise to care for your daughter as if she were my own." Something about those words, "as if she were my own," made Hank's chest tighten. He didn't want anyone replacing Eliza, not in Grace's life and certainly not in his. But he needed help, and Victoria seemed capable and sincere. "When can you start?" he asked. "Immediately, if you'd like. I can collect my things from town today and be settled by evening. We could bring your daughter home tomorrow." The thought of having Grace at the ranch, of starting this new reality, sent a wave of anxiety through Hank, but he nodded. "All right, let's do that." They spent the rest of the morning discussing practical matters: Victoria's wages, her responsibilities, Hank's expectations. By afternoon, they had reached an agreement, and Victoria prepared to return to town to gather her belongings. As Hank helped her mount her horse, he found himself asking, "Why did you come west, Mrs. Harmon?" "After your husband passed," Victoria hesitated, her hands tightening slightly on the reins. "A fresh start, I suppose. Too many memories in Boston. And perhaps a bit of that same spirit that brings most people to these territories, the hope of building something new." She met his gaze. "Not so different from your reasons, I imagine," Hank nodded, understanding all too well the desire to escape painful memories. "I'll see you this evening, then." "Yes," she said, turning her horse toward town. "And Mr. Morgan, try not to worry too much. Children are remarkably resilient. With love and care, your daughter will thrive." As he watched her ride away, Hank felt a small measure of the weight lift from his shoulders. He wasn't convinced this arrangement would work, but for the first time since Eliza's death, he felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps he wouldn't have to give up his daughter after all. True to her word, Victoria returned that evening with her belongings, 2 trunks and a few personal items. Hank helped her settle into the loft, an open space above the main room that had been used mostly for storage. It offered little privacy, but Victoria seemed unbothered by the simplicity of the accommodations. "I'll make some curtains," she said, surveying the space, "to make it a bit more private. But this will do nicely for now." While Victoria unpacked, Hank prepared a simple supper. His cooking skills were basic at best, but he managed to put together a meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee. As they ate, an awkward silence fell between them. "I should warn you," Hank said finally, "I don't know much about having a woman around the house. Eliza, she was patient with me. I'm not always the easiest man to live with." Victoria smiled slightly. "Mr. Morgan, I'm not here to judge your living habits. I'm here to care for your daughter and help manage the household. As long as we can establish a routine that works for Grace, that's all that matters." "You can call me Hank," he offered. "Mr. Morgan makes me feel like my father." "Then you must call me Victoria," she replied. "Or Vic, if you prefer. My friends back east often did." The exchange felt significant somehow, a small step toward the familiarity they would need to make this arrangement work. After supper, Victoria insisted on cleaning up while Hank attended to the evening chores. By the time he returned from the barn, she had transformed the kitchen, organizing Eliza's hodgepodge of cooking implements and supplies into a more efficient arrangement. "I hope you don't mind," she said, noticing his surprise. "I thought it might be helpful to have things in order before the baby arrives." For a moment, Hank felt a surge of resentment. This was Eliza's kitchen, arranged the way she liked it. But the practical part of him recognized that Victoria was right, they needed order now more than ever. "It's fine," he said, "probably for the best." Victoria seemed to sense his discomfort. I understand this is difficult, Hank, having a stranger in your home making changes. If there's anything I do that bothers you, please tell me. This will only work if we're honest with each other. Her frankness caught him off guard. Most women he knew tiptoed around difficult subjects, but Victoria addressed them head-on. I appreciate that, he said, and I'll try to do the same. That night, as Hank lay on the makeshift bed he'd made in the barn, he thought about the day's events. Tomorrow, Grace would come home. Tomorrow, he would begin the impossible task of being a father without Eliza by his side, but at least he wouldn't be doing it entirely alone. The next morning, they rode into town together to collect Grace from Mrs. Patterson. Hank felt a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest as they approached the midwife's home. What if Grace had forgotten him already? What if she sensed that her mother was gone? Mrs. Patterson welcomed them warmly, leading them to a small cradle where Grace lay sleeping. The sight of his daughter, so tiny, so perfect, brought a fresh wave of grief and love crashing over Hank. "She's been good as gold," Mrs. Patterson said, carefully lifting the sleeping infant and placing her in Victoria's arms. "The wet nurse has been by this morning, so she's fed and content for now." Victoria cradled Grace with practiced ease, her expression softening as she gazed down at the baby's face. "She's beautiful, Hank. She has your chin, I think." Hank couldn't speak. He could only nod, watching as this stranger held his daughter with such natural tenderness. Mrs. Patterson pulled him aside while Victoria cooed softly to Grace. "I've arranged for Mary Cooper to visit your ranch twice a day to nurse the baby. She has a young one of her own and plenty of milk to spare. She lives just 3 miles from you." "Thank you," Hank managed, "for everything." "You take care of that little girl," Mrs. Patterson said firmly, "and let Mrs. Harmon help you. Don't let pride get in the way of what's best for Grace." The journey back to the ranch was tense, with Hank driving the wagon as carefully as possible over the rutted road while Victoria held Grace securely in her arms. Every bump made him wince, certain the jostling would upset the baby, but Grace remained peacefully asleep. "She's sturdier than she looks," Victoria assured him, noticing his concern. "Babies are remarkably adaptable." When they arrived at the ranch, Victoria immediately set about establishing a space for Grace in the small room off the kitchen. She had brought additional supplies from town: soft blankets, diapers, and a few small garments that Mrs. Patterson had contributed. "Mary Cooper will be here in a few hours for the first feeding," Victoria explained as she settled Grace in the crib. "In the meantime, I thought I might prepare some soup for dinner. You must be hungry." Hank nodded absently, his attention fixed on his sleeping daughter. Now that she was here in the home he had built for her mother, the reality of his loss struck him anew. How would he ever tell Grace about Eliza? How would he ensure she knew how much her mother had loved her, even before she was born? "Would you like some time alone with her?" Victoria asked softly, seeming to read his thoughts. "Yes," Hank said, grateful for her perception. "Thank you." Victoria slipped out, closing the door quietly behind her. Hank moved to the crib, carefully reaching down to touch Grace's tiny hand. Her fingers instinctively curled around his thumb, and the simple gesture brought tears to his eyes. "I'm sorry your mama isn't here," he whispered. "She wanted to meet you so badly. She had so many plans for us, for our family." He swallowed hard. "I don't know if I can be what you need, little one, but I promise I'll try." The days that followed established a new rhythm at the Morgan Ranch. Mary Cooper arrived faithfully morning and evening to nurse Grace. Victoria managed the household with quiet efficiency, and Hank threw himself into his work, trying to outrun his grief in the long days of physical labor. At first, he kept his distance from both Victoria and Grace, coming inside only for meals and to check briefly on his daughter before retreating to the barn where he still slept. He told himself it was to avoid disturbing the baby at night, but in truth, he couldn't bear the emptiness of the house without Eliza. Victoria never pressured him to be more involved, but she made sure he knew everything about Grace's day: her first real smile, the way she followed movement with her eyes, how she quieted when Victoria sang to her. Bit by bit, these small details drew Hank back into the house, into his daughter's life. One evening, about 2 weeks after Grace came home, Hank returned from checking the herd to find Victoria sitting in Eliza's rocking chair by the fire, Grace asleep against her shoulder. The scene stopped him in his tracks. It was so domestic, so reminiscent of the future he had imagined with Eliza. Victoria looked up, catching his expression. She was fussy after her feeding, she explained softly. Sometimes the motion helps her settle. Hank nodded, removing his hat and coat. Eliza used to do that. Rock in that chair, I mean. Even before Grace was born, said the baby could feel the motion. It was the first time he had voluntarily mentioned Eliza since Victoria's arrival. She sounds like she was a wonderful mother even before she had the chance, Victoria said gently. She would have been, Hank agreed, his voice rough with emotion. She had been planning for this baby since the day we found out, reading books, making clothes, talking to other mothers in town. Victoria smiled. Will you tell me about her, about Eliza? It might be good for Grace to hear stories about her mother as she grows. The invitation to talk about Eliza opened something in Hank. That evening, as Victoria prepared Grace for bed, he found himself sharing memories how he and Eliza had met at a harvest dance in Iowa, her determination to come west despite her parents' objections. The way she had embraced ranch life with enthusiasm despite its hardships. She never complained, Hank said, watching as Victoria gently laid Grace in her crib. Not about the isolation or the work or the weather. She said it was an adventure building something from nothing. She sounds remarkable, Victoria said. Grace is fortunate to have inherited her spirit, I'm sure. After that night, the walls between them began to come down. Hank started taking more interest in Grace's care, asking Victoria to show him how to hold her properly, how to change her, what the different cries meant. He began spending evenings in the house rather than the barn, though he still slept there. Victoria, for her part, gradually shared more of her own story. Her husband, Henry, had been a professor at Harvard who died of pneumonia after just 2 years of marriage. They had planned to start a family, but it wasn't to be. After he died, I went back to working as a governess, she explained one evening as they sat by the fire, Grace asleep in her crib. But it was difficult, caring for other people's children when I had hoped to have my own. When I read about the opportunities out west, it seemed like a chance to start fresh. You regret it? Hank asked. Coming here, Victoria considered the question. No, she said finally. It's not an easy life, but there's an honesty to it that I appreciate, and now there's Grace. She smiled softly. I never expected to find a purpose so quickly. As spring gave way to summer, the ranch flourished under their combined efforts. Victoria proved to be not just capable with Grace, but also resourceful in managing the household. She started a vegetable garden, took over the care of the chickens, and even learned to make simple repairs when Hank was busy with the cattle. Grace thrived as well, growing stronger each day. By 4 months, she was rolling over and reaching for objects, her dark eyes so like Eliza's, taking in everything around her with evident curiosity. Mary Cooper continued to nurse her, but Victoria had begun introducing her to other foods as well, preparing simple cereals and mashed vegetables. Hank found himself increasingly drawn to his daughter, marveling at each new development. He began taking her with him for short rides around the property, cradled securely against his chest in a sling Victoria had fashioned. These quiet moments, with Grace's weight warm against him and the landscape spreading out before them, became a balm to his wounded heart. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Victoria broached a subject they had both been avoiding. Hank, she began carefully, I've been thinking about my position here. He tensed, suddenly afraid she was going to leave. The thought unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. We never discussed how long this arrangement would last, she continued. I've been here nearly 3 months now, and I'm wondering what your expectations are for the future. Hank hadn't allowed himself to think beyond each day, each week. The idea of planning a future still felt like a betrayal of the one he had imagined with Eliza. I hadn't really thought about it, he admitted. Do you want to leave? Victoria shook her head quickly. No, that's not what I meant. I've grown very attached to Grace and to, she hesitated, to this place, to the life here. I just want to understand what role you see me having as Grace gets older. It was a fair question, one that deserved careful consideration. I don't know, Hank said honestly. When we started this, I was just trying to keep my head above water. Now. He looked over at Victoria, really looked at her in the fading light. The past months had brought color to her cheeks and subtle highlights to her auburn hair. She seemed more at ease here than he would have expected from a woman raised in the city. Now I can't imagine this place without you, he finished simply. You've made it a home again for me and for Grace. Victoria's eyes widened slightly at his words. Thank you for saying that. It means a great deal to me. Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement that their arrangement had become something more than a business transaction, more than a temporary solution to a crisis. Would you consider staying? Hank asked. Not just for now, but for the long term. Grace needs stability, and you've become important to her, to both of us. Victoria smiled, a genuine warmth lighting her features. I would like that very much, Hank. This feels more like home to me now than anywhere has since Henry died. That night, for the first time since Eliza's death, Hank slept in the house on a pallet near the fireplace, but inside nonetheless. It felt like a significant step, an acceptance that life was continuing, evolving into something new that might hold its own kind of happiness. As summer progressed into fall, their routine evolved further. Victoria began accompanying Hank and Grace on longer excursions around the ranch, showing a surprising interest in the cattle operation. She was a quick learner, and Hank found himself enjoying the process of teaching her about ranch work. My father would be scandalized, Victoria laughed one afternoon as Hank showed her how to mend a section of fence. He believed women should confine themselves to domestic pursuits. Good thing he's not here then, Hank replied with a smile. Besides, on a ranch, everyone needs to know a bit of everything. Eliza could ride and shoot as well as most men I know. The mention of Eliza no longer brought the sharp pain it once had. Grief still visited him, especially in quiet moments, but it had softened around the edges. He found comfort in sharing memories of her with Victoria, who listened with genuine interest and encouraged him to tell stories about Eliza to Grace. By the time Grace celebrated her first birthday, a small affair with the Coopers, and Mrs. Patterson joining them at the ranch, Hank realized that something fundamental had changed in his relationship with Victoria. They had developed a partnership that went beyond their original arrangement, a friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. He found himself looking forward to their evenings together, to their conversations about books. Victoria had brought quite a collection with her from Boston, about the ranch's future, about Grace's development. Victoria's perspective often challenged his own, making him consider new possibilities he might otherwise have overlooked. It was Mary Cooper who first made him confront his evolving feelings. She had arrived for Grace's afternoon feeding and found Hank and Victoria in the garden, laughing together as Grace attempted to catch a butterfly that had landed on a nearby sunflower. "You three make a fine family," Mary commented as she settled with Grace for nursing. "It does my heart good to see it." Hank started to correct her to explain that Victoria was an employee, not family, but the words stuck in his throat. The truth was, they had become a family of sorts, bound together by their love for Grace and the life they were building. That evening, after Grace was asleep, Hank joined Victoria on the porch where she sat mending one of his shirts. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and approaching winter. "Mary said something today that got me thinking," he began, settling into the chair beside her. Victoria looked up from her sewing. "Oh, she called us a family, you, me, and Grace." Victoria's hands stilled, her expression carefully neutral. "I suppose we have developed a certain familiarity, but I understand my position here, Hank. I'm not trying to replace Eliza." "I know that," he said quickly. "That's not what I meant." He struggled to find the right words. "I guess I'm just realizing that we've become more than what we started as. You're not just Grace's nurse or a housekeeper. You're—" He paused, searching for the proper term. "You're a partner." In all this, Victoria's expression softened. Thank you for saying that. I've come to care deeply for both of you, more than I probably should given my position. There was something in her tone, a hint of emotion carefully restrained that made Hank's heart beat faster. He had been so focused on his grief, on surviving each day, that he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge the growing attraction he felt toward Victoria. It seemed disloyal somehow to Eliza's memory. I'm not sure what the proper thing is here, Hank admitted. I still miss Eliza. I think I always will, but I've also come to. He hesitated, unsure how to express feelings he was only just beginning to understand himself. It's all right, Hank, Victoria said gently. You don't need to say anything more, we have time, there's no rush to define what we are to each other. Her understanding gave him courage. Would you consider moving into the house? Properly, I mean, not just the loft. There's the small room next to Grace's. It would be more comfortable for you, especially as winter comes on. Victoria looked surprised but pleased by the suggestion. Are you sure? It would change things between us in the eyes of others. I'm sure, Hank said firmly, and as for others, well, this is our life, not theirs. The move, simple as it was, marked another evolution in their relationship. Having Victoria fully integrated into the household, with her own proper space rather than the makeshift accommodations of the loft, acknowledged her importance in their lives. As winter settled over Montana, bringing short days and long, cold nights, the three of them developed new routines. Evenings were spent by the fire, with Victoria reading aloud from one of her books, while Grace played on a quilt at their feet, and Hank whittled small wooden toys for his increasingly active daughter. Grace's first steps came just after Christmas tentative, wobbling movements from the fireplace to Victoria's outstretched arms. Hank watched, his heart full, as Victoria's face lit up with pride and joy. "Did you see that?" she exclaimed, gathering Grace into a hug. "You clever girl." "Walking already, just like her mother," Hank said softly. "Eliza was always in a hurry to get places too." Victoria smiled, her eyes meeting his over Grace's dark curls. "She has the best of both of you in her." That night after Grace was asleep, Hank found Victoria still sitting by the fire, a book open in her lap though she didn't seem to be reading it. "Thank you," he said, settling into the chair opposite her. She looked up, puzzled. "For what?" "For making it possible for me to keep her. For helping me see that I could be a father to her, even without Eliza." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "When Eliza died, I thought my life was over. I couldn't imagine how to go on, let alone how to raise a child on my own, but you showed me a way forward." Victoria closed her book, her expression serious. "You're giving me too much credit, Hank. You would have found your way. You love Grace too much to have given up." "Maybe," he conceded, "but it would have been a harder road without you." He hesitated, then added, "and a lonelier one." Something shifted in Victoria's gaze at his words. "I was lonely too, you know. After Henry died, I thought that part of my life was finished. I came west thinking I would find independence, maybe purpose in work, but not connection, not family." The word hung between them, full of meaning. "We are a family," Hank said quietly. "Unusual as it might be, and I'm grateful for it, for you." Victoria's smile was luminous in the firelight. "I'm grateful too, Hank, more than I can say." As winter slowly gave way to spring, bringing new life to the ranch, Hank found himself contemplating a future he hadn't dared imagine before. Victoria had become essential to him not just for her help with Grace and the household, but for her companionship, her insights, her presence in his life. He thought often of Mary Cooper's words about them being a family, and he knew it was true in all the ways that mattered. But there was still a line they hadn't crossed, a formality that remained between them despite the warmth of their friendship. It was Grace who inadvertently pushed them over that line. She had been practicing new words daily, delighting both Hank and Victoria with her expanding vocabulary. "Papa" had been among her first words, bringing tears to Hank's eyes the first time she said it. But it was what she called Victoria that changed everything. They were in the garden, Victoria showing Grace how to plant seeds for the summer vegetables, when Grace looked up at her and said clearly, "Mama." Victoria froze, her eyes wide with surprise and uncertainty. She glanced at Hank, who had been repairing a nearby fence and had heard the word clearly. Grace, sweetheart, Victoria said carefully. I'm Victoria. Can you say Victoria? But Grace just smiled and repeated, Mama, reaching up to pat Victoria's cheek with her small hand. That evening, after Grace was asleep, Victoria approached Hank with obvious apprehension. About what happened today, she began. I want you to know I've never encouraged her to call me that. I always refer to myself as Victoria when I talk to her, and I make sure to tell her stories about Eliza, about her real mother. Hank could see the genuine distress in Victoria's eyes. I know that, he assured her, and I'm not upset. Victoria looked surprised. You're not. No, he said simply. Because in all the ways that matter, you are her mother. You've been there for every milestone, every fever, every laugh and tear. You love her as your own. Anyone can see that. But Eliza will always be Grace's mother too, Hank finished for her. And Grace will know about her, will understand how much Eliza wanted her and loved her, even before she was born. But that doesn't change what you are to her now. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. I do love her, she whispered, as if she were my own flesh and blood. I never expected to feel this way about another woman's child, but from the moment I first held her, she claimed a piece of my heart. Hank moved closer, drawn by the emotion in her voice. And what about me? He asked quietly. Have I claimed a piece as well? Victoria met his gaze, her expression vulnerable but honest. A larger piece than I ever intended to give, she admitted. I tried to keep my feelings professional, to remember my place here, but somewhere along the way, you stopped being an employee, Hank finished for her, and became something else entirely. The tension between them had been building for months, acknowledged in small gestures and unspoken words. Now, with Grace's innocent declaration forcing them to confront their feelings, Hank found the courage to cross the final distance between them. He reached out, taking Victoria's hand in his. I think I've been falling in love with you, he said simply. Slowly, cautiously, with plenty of guilt along the way, but there it is, Victoria's breath caught. Hank, she whispered, her fingers tightening around his. Are you sure? I never wanted to intrude on your memories of Eliza, to make you feel you had to offer me more than employment and friendship. I'm sure, he said firmly, and I think Eliza would understand. She wouldn't have wanted Grace and me to live half-lives, clinging to grief instead of embracing what happiness we can find. Victoria stepped closer, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest. I love you, she said softly, and I love Grace as if she were my own daughter. I think I have almost from the beginning, though I tried not to admit it to myself. Hank lifted his hand to her face, gently brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Then, with a tenderness that surprised even him, he leaned down and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, tentative at first, but deepening as Victoria responded with an eagerness that matched his own. When they finally pulled apart, Victoria's cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright with emotion. What happens now? She asked. Now, Hank said, we stop pretending that we're just employer and employee. We acknowledge what we really are, a family. And what will people say? The town, the neighbors? Hank smiled slightly. I suspect they've been expecting this for some time. Mary Cooper certainly has. But even if they haven't, it doesn't matter. This is our life, our family. In the weeks that followed, their relationship deepened, the barriers between them falling away as they embraced their feelings for each other. They were careful to maintain separate bedrooms, mindful of propriety, but in every other way they became partners in the fullest sense of the word. They began making plans for the future, expanding the cattle operation, adding onto the house, discussing Victoria's ideas for starting a small school for the neighboring ranch children who had limited access to education. By early summer, with Grace now a sturdy, chattering toddler of 18 months, Hank knew it was time to formalize what had already become reality in their hearts. He chose a clear June evening, similar to the one when he had first asked Victoria to consider staying at the ranch long-term. They were sitting on the porch after putting Grace to bed, enjoying the lingering daylight and the gentle sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Victoria was describing her latest letter from her sister in Boston, amused by the city gossip that now seemed so distant from their life in Montana. Victoria, Hank interrupted gently. There's something I've been wanting to ask you. She turned to him, her expression curious. Yes, Hank reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box crude but carefully made by his own hands. Inside was a ring, simple but elegant, that he had purchased on his last trip to Helena. I love you, he said simply, and Grace loves you. We're already a family in all the ways that matter, but I'd like to make it official. He opened the box, revealing the gold band set with a small pearl. Will you marry me? Be my wife and Grace's mother in the eyes of the law as well as in our hearts. Victoria's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with surprise and joy. Oh, Hank, she breathed. Yes, yes, of course I will. He slipped the ring onto her finger and she admired it in the fading light. It's beautiful, she whispered. Perfect? Like you, Hank said, drawing her into his arms. You came into our lives when we were at our lowest point and you brought light back into this home. I can never repay that gift, Victoria shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. You've given me just as much a family, a purpose, a love I never expected to find again. We've healed each other, I think. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Meadow Creek. Grace, dressed in a white dress Victoria had sewn for the occasion, toddled down the aisle ahead of them, scattering wildflower petals and charming everyone present. Mrs. Patterson, who had played such a crucial role in bringing them together, beamed from the front pew. Mary Cooper and her family attended as well, along with the neighboring ranchers who had come to respect the unlikely partnership Hank and Victoria had formed. The minister, recognizing the unique circumstances of their union, adapted the traditional vows to acknowledge Grace's place in their commitment to each other. Do you, Victoria, take this man to be your husband, and this child to be your daughter, to love and cherish them both all the days of your life? He asked. I do, Victoria replied, her voice clear and confident. And do you, Hank, take this woman to be your wife, to stand beside you as partner and mother to your child, to love and cherish all the days of your life? I do, Hank answered, his eyes never leaving Victoria's face. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Hank gathered both Victoria and Grace into his arms, embracing the family they had become against all odds. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, with tables set up under the cottonwood trees and lanterns hanging from the branches. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, a joyful affirmation of new beginnings. As evening fell, Hank found a moment alone with Victoria, drawing her away from the festivities to the quiet of the porch where so many of their important conversations had taken place. Happy? He asked, wrapping his arms around her waist. Completely, she assured him, leaning back against his chest. I never imagined when I came west that I would find this kind of happiness again. Nor did I, Hank admitted. After Eliza died, I thought that part of my life was over. I was just trying to survive, to find a way to care for Grace. He pressed a kiss to Victoria's temple. I never expected to fall in love again. Victoria turned in his arms, facing him. Do you think Eliza would approve of us of this? It was a question that had weighed on Hank's mind at times, especially in the early days of his feelings for Victoria. But now, with the clarity that came from having made peace with his grief, he had no doubts. Yes, he said firmly. Eliza's greatest concern was always for Grace's happiness and for mine. She would be grateful that Grace has a mother who loves her so completely and that I've found someone to share my life with again. He smiled softly. She was never one for self-pity or dwelling in sorrow. She believed in embracing life fully, in finding joy where you could. Victoria nodded, seeming reassured by his words. Then we'll make sure Grace knows about her, about the brave, vibrant woman who gave her life. We'll keep Eliza's memory alive for her. We will, Hank agreed. And we'll build on the foundation Eliza and I started, creating a life and a home that honors her memory while embracing our future together. As they rejoined the celebration, Hank watched Victoria sweep Grace up into a dance, their daughter's delighted giggles rising above the music. The scene filled his heart with a profound gratitude for the unexpected turns his life had taken, for the resilience that had carried him through his darkest days, and for the woman who had helped him find his way back to joy. In the years that followed, the Morgan Ranch prospered under Hank and Victoria's joint stewardship. They expanded the cattle operation, added a small orchard, and built a new wing onto the house to accommodate their growing family. A year after their marriage, Victoria gave birth to a son they named Henry, after her first husband, a gesture of acknowledgement that their past loves remained part of who they were, even as they built their new life together. 2 more children followed Robert and Elizabeth, the latter named in honor of Eliza. Grace grew into a capable, compassionate young woman who combined Hank's quiet strength with elements of both Eliza's spirit and Victoria's intelligence. She knew the story of her birth and of the mother who had given her life, thanks to Victoria's careful preservation of Eliza's memory through stories and keepsakes. Victoria's dream of establishing a school became reality as well. She converted an unused barn on the property into a classroom where she taught not only her own children, but those from neighboring ranches who had previously had little access to education. Her background as a governess, combined with her natural patience and creativity, made her an excellent teacher. As for Hank, the grief that had once threatened to overwhelm him gradually transformed into a quiet appreciation for the unexpected blessings his life had brought. He never forgot Eliza or ceased to honor her memory, but he found that it was possible to carry that love alongside the deep, abiding affection he felt for Victoria. On Grace's 18th birthday, Hank took her riding to a hilltop overlooking the ranch, a special place where he had often gone with Eliza to watch the sunset. There, he gave her a letter that Eliza had written during her pregnancy, meant to be opened on this very day. "Your mother wanted you to have this," he said simply, watching as Grace's fingers traced her name written in Eliza's flowing script. "Will you stay while I read it?" Grace asked, her dark eyes so like Eliza's serious in her young face. "If you want me to," Hank replied. Grace nodded, carefully opening the letter. As she read, tears filled her eyes, but she was smiling to a smile that reminded Hank powerfully of Eliza. "She says she hopes I'll have her sense of adventure and your steadfastness," Grace said, looking up from the pages. "And that no matter what happens, I should know I was wanted and loved from the very beginning." Hank nodded, his own eyes damp. "You were, by both of us," she also says. Grace hesitated, then continued, "She says that if for some reason she isn't here to see me grow up, that I shouldn't grieve too deeply for what might have been, but instead embrace what is." She looked at her father thoughtfully. "It's almost as if she knew, isn't it?" "Your mother had remarkable intuition," Hank said, "and a practical nature. She always believed in preparing for all possibilities." Grace carefully folded the letter and returned it to its envelope. "I'm lucky, you know," she said after a moment. "Some might think it sad growing up without your birth mother, but I've had 2 mothers who loved me, one who gave me life and one who helped shape it." She smiled. "And a father who was brave enough to keep going when it would have been easier to give up." Hank reached out, squeezing his daughter's hand. "We're all lucky, Grace. Your arrival changed everything, brought sorrow, yes, but also the chance for new joy. Without you, Victoria might never have come into our lives, our family might never have been." As they rode back to the ranch in the gathering dusk, Hank felt a profound sense of completion. The journey from grief to healing had been long and often difficult, but looking at the home they had built at Victoria, waiting on the porch with Henry, Robert, and Elizabeth, at the prosperous ranch spread out around them, at Grace riding tall and confident beside him, he knew that he had found his way to exactly where he was meant to be. That night, after the birthday celebration and once the children were asleep, Hank and Victoria sat together on the porch swing, a ritual they had maintained throughout their marriage. The same stars that had witnessed their first tentative conversations now shone down on their comfortable companionship. "Grace showed me Eliza's letter," Victoria said softly. "It was a beautiful gift for her." Hank nodded. "Eliza wrote several for different birthdays, for her wedding day, for when she might have her first child. I've kept them safe all these years." Victoria leaned her head against his shoulder. "She was a remarkable woman. I wish I could have known her." "In some ways you do," Hank replied. Through Grace, through the stories we've shared, and I think she knows you too somehow." He smiled slightly. "She would approve of what we've built here, of the mother you've been to Grace, of the family we've created together." Victoria lifted her face to his, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "Thank you for letting me be part of it, for trusting me with your heart and with Grace's. Thank you for helping me find my way back to living," Hank said simply, drawing her closer. "For showing me that love doesn't diminish what came before, but rather builds upon it, creating something new and equally precious." As they sat together under the vast Montana sky, Hank reflected on the unlikely journey that had brought them to this moment. From the deepest grief had come unexpected joy, from devastating loss, the foundation for a new beginning. It wasn't the life he had planned, but it was rich and full and deeply satisfying, a testament to the resilience of the human heart and its capacity for love in all its forms. And as Victoria's hand found his in the darkness, fingers intertwining with familiar warmth, Hank knew with absolute certainty that this was where he belonged, not in spite of the past, but because of it. The road had been long and often painful, but it had led him home.